So what I want to talk about in this video is the environments that we create as a missional community. This is where small groups often go wrong. Small groups try to typically, almost always, try to accomplish everything in one environment, right? So if we're part of a small group, a life group, a D group, whatever you call it, it's typically, hey, yeah, our small group meets on Thursday nights from 6 to 8. And that's your one space. That's your one environment. That is where you're trying to accomplish pretty much everything you're trying to accomplish as a small group, typically. And that's problematic in that it's so limiting. So what inevitably ends up happening, and of course, you've probably experienced this for yourself maybe numerous times, is that a small group inevitably becomes stuck and inwardly focused, right? And the reason for that is you've got one environment where your group meets. Let's say you're 8 to 12 people or whatever, and you meet in the living room every Thursday night at this time, and you go on this journey together, and what ends up happening is that group becomes its own thing, right? And it becomes very, very difficult to invite anybody else to be a part of that group, right? It becomes very difficult to break in because we all have something here, right? We have a relational reality and dynamic that's been developed over time. And for someone to walk in the room, almost immediately they start to pick up on the fact that there is a closed circle here, there's a group dynamic here that I'm not a part of, and I don't know how to break into it. And those of us in the room don't know how to really bring you into it and catch you up because we've gone through all these things together already. Right, so it becomes a very closed, circular Christian circle. And it's hard even for Christians to break into that group, right? Depending on the goal of your life group, that's a problem. As we think about participating in the mission of God, it's a really big problem. Because if you can imagine, just imagine trying to invite somebody into that space to be a part of that group who not only has not been a part of that group, but they don't really share your faith. Like they're not a follower of Jesus. Maybe they're a nun, maybe they're a dun, maybe they're a skeptic, maybe they're agnostic, they're pre-Christian, maybe they're post-Christian, but they're definitely not following after the way of Jesus. And they are invited into this living room. I mean, we all know how that's going to go down. It's not going to go well. That is an intimidating space, even for a Christian to walk into. And not only is it intimidating for an unbeliever to walk into, it's an inappropriate space, right? Even whether it's a social group primarily, which typically small groups become that, or they become Bible studies. In either case, that's a very intimidating, if not inappropriate space to invite an unbeliever into. Right? And so that's why as a missional community, when we think about who we are and the rhythms that we adopt and how we function together, we don't just operate in a single space. We function in multiple spaces. And we create spaces based on what is appropriate for people. Like how can we create spaces where people can enter in regardless of where they are in their spiritual journey, right? Which requires us putting to the side what we would prefer, what we want. We might want a strictly Christian social group or want a Bible study, but we need to figure out how to both have deep connections and be a people of the Word of God while also participating, right, in mission. So the way that we do that is by creating different environments, right? And so I want to talk to you about 3 different environments that a missional community creates and lives in, right? And you see I've drawn, I don't know if you can see it, you might have to zoom in a little bit. It's a well, and it's the best well that I can draw. But I like the picture of a well as a metaphor, right? For those of you who've been through the residency, there's a period in there where we talk a little bit about wells and walls, and this idea of how the church is really good at building walls, but not very good at building wells, and uses this metaphor of these giant sprawling acreages and farms in places like rural Australia. And what they find is when you dig a well and you dig it deep enough, you don't need fences to keep animals close by because they won't venture very far from the life source, right, from the water, right? And so the picture is that's what we're doing in missional communities. We are digging wells. We're creating wells where people can slowly draw closer to experiencing the water of life, the living water, right? Jesus himself. So in a missional community, you've got, we'll talk about the first environment or first space, right? So this first environment is what we call the core. And I'll just write that right here, right? So this is your discipleship core, this first space, this first environment. These are the people who are around the well with you. They are committed to be a people of the living water. They are Jesus people. They are a people of the way. These are the people who you are on mission with, that you are creating within this missional community together with. You're life on life. You're united in your commitment to Christ, and you are doing this together. This is the discipleship red hot center of a missional community. This is the place where you're going to do explicit things as it pertains to being a people of the way. This is where you're worshiping, right? This is where you're doing a whole lot of worshiping, right? That could be through music, maybe. That certainly is in being a people of the Word, right? You're digging in the Scriptures together. You're planning and creating these different environments for friends and neighbors and colleagues who don't know Jesus to just connect and to be closer to the well of life. That's your first environment. That's the core environment. And this is the foundation, of course, for your missional community. This is where it all begins. So when we talk about, defining your dream and finding your team, this is your team. This is your crew. You're doing this together. All right, the second, we'll do this. There's a second environment, which we call the table environment. And then outside of that, there is a third environment, which we call the party environment. So when you begin a missional community, typically, unless you have a bunch of relationships that are significant with people who don't know Christ currently, oftentimes for a missional community, especially a community like ours that's starting missional communities with people that are coming from an established church, you begin with your core, right? And the next step is you begin creating party environments, right? And so with your core, you find a rhythm that works for you. Our missional community, we meet every other Sunday, right? And so even as we begin gathering with the whole Commonwealth family, we're meeting every other week, and there's purpose behind that. Part of that is because the all gathering, while it's valuable, it's not the most important, it's not primary. It's just for us to all get to be together, to dive into the Scriptures in a public space, to share stories of what God is doing and what we're trying and what's not working, what's failing, to encourage and just experience corporate worship. But we do that every other week, and then our missional community core, we meet together on the off weeks, right? And so every month, it's roughly twice a month that we meet together, and that's where we're breaking bread, we're in the Scriptures. We'll talk more about that in the next video. But then there's a third space, the third environment, the other environment that we create is the party environment. And the party environment is where you create safe spaces for people to come in. They don't have to think like you at all, believe like you at all, for them to feel safe, to feel connected in this environment, right? These are football parties, and these are barbecues, and maybe like living room concerts and wine and cheese nights, for a bunch of people. It can be a million different things, but the point is, this is an environment that is it's a zero entry pool, right? You don't have to be able to swim, let alone know the deep end. You can just enjoy the water safely, whether you're an adult or a child. And so we're creating an environment that's safe, it's inviting, it's fun, and we're doing it just to create opportunities for us to connect with people that are elsewhere on the spiritual spectrum and on their journey. Now, when people start to lean in, that's when we have a need now for the second environment. When people start to lean in, and what I mean by that is they're taking interest in what's going on. They're beginning to open up the door of their heart and to their life. They're beginning to share with you. And they're showing interest in more than just being around one another and enjoying each other's company, right? They're starting to ask questions about life. They're starting to ask questions about what this thing is and these other people that you're connected to. Maybe they're asking explicit questions about what you believe or about Jesus or about this church/cult called Commonwealth that you're a part of. At that point, right, you need the second environment, the table environment. Right, the table environment, it's not as big and widespread and low entry as a party. It's much more intimate. And this is a space where you can have more direct, intimate conversations. And this might be literally gathering around the table, right? And here's the key. You need to be upfront about what you're inviting people to. So for your Commonwealth, for your missional community core, when you're gathering as a core, you all need to know this is our core time and space, right? Which means everything's on the table. Explicit Jesus conversation, gospel conversation, life on life, all of those things. Nothing's really off limits. This is a Christian, people of the way space. When you create a party space, right, to make sure it's not a bait and switch, or that your people aren't just like hunting and trying to force conversations that maybe aren't appropriate yet, you let them know this is a party space, right? So come, be yourself. If things come up, you can talk about those. Like, you don't have to hide Jesus, but we're also not trying to force something that they might not be ready for yet. We're just being together and creating a communal, fun space. The table environment is different, right? When you invite somebody to the table environment, and the intention is to have more robust conversations, more meaningful conversations about story and life, maybe about Jesus, the Bible. Let them know that when you invite them in, right? Let them know, hey, me and a few friends, we're going to share a meal at our place, and we're going to be talking a little bit more about what Jesus is like and what it means to follow him. And so it's when people lean in the party space that we start to create that second space. Right, and so you have to be thinking through layers, right? Thinking through when are we going to gather as a core together? Every other week tends to be a really good rhythm for that. We designed our all Commonwealth gatherings with that in mind, so you can meet on the off weeks. Then together you're going to plan party environments and pull those off together. And then as people lean in spiritually, start to create table environments to take the conversation further. Hey, we're gathering on the table. Hey, we're having a few people over around the fire this Friday night. We're going to smoke cigars and have a couple beers and talk about Jesus and talk about life. Right, so those are your three environments. So here's just a few questions for you at this point as you're thinking about next steps. A few questions put your way. Again, think through this. Number one, whom are you trying to reach, touch, or serve? Right, before you do this, jump into this, just you need to get clear on that calling piece, people, place, cause. Number two, how can you jump right in? Right, if you're clear on where God's calling you, maybe as clear as you've been, once you know that and you've got a few people, how can you jump right in to joining God and what he's up to? Even if it's messy, even if you don't feel like you have the answers, how can I jump right in? Three, what does the first wave of mission look like for your missional community? Right, as you think about your people, place, cause. What is that the first tries, the first experiments? If phase two is gathering and experimenting, what are our first experiments together that we could do in this first season? And then lastly, thinking through rhythms, right? So as you think about your life, you think about your people, your place, your cause, what are the rhythms that are going to work for us? For our missional community, for us, it's every other week with our core. And then elsewhere during the month, we're seeking to do at least one party environment. And then, we're just relaunching ours. And then the goal would be to have at least one table environment as well. But for you, what makes the most sense with your calling?